Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge Survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution, and today I'll be quizzing Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific program, on the Chinese Communist Party's recently concluded Third Plenum. Just to set the broad context for our listeners, each time China witnesses a change or a renewal in leadership, the third plenary session of the new Central Committee serves as an indication of how the country will be led for the next 5 years. We know that the third plenum was much anticipated because this plenary meeting, which brings together the party elite, has traditionally taken place in late autumn, the same year that the National People's Congress is concluded. But this time it was held in July the next year, and so there was anticipation regarding what's to come. And more importantly, the meeting came at a time when the Chinese economy is facing deep structural challenges, and it sparked a lot of questions as to what the economic, political, and social trajectory of China looks like. And historically, the third plenums have focused on shaping the economic agenda of the country. We know for a fact that the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in December 1978 launched the reform and opening up in China under Deng Xiaoping. And, the third plenary session has just become a legacy ever since. And even the third plenary session in 2013 talked about comprehensive deepening of reforms pertaining to transforming the hukou system or the house owning system in China, reforming state-owned enterprises, bridging the urban-rural divide, so on and so forth. And for this 2024 third plenary session, the outcome document called the Decision of the CPC Central Committee on Further Comprehensively Deepening Reform and Promoting Modernization with Chinese Characteristics. It's a mouthful, but it came out just a couple weeks ago on the 21st of July, and it's a long document comprising 15 kind of overarching sections with 60 subsections. So in this episode, we'll try and cover only a few significant developments evident from this decisions document. So Manoj, if I may come to you first, let's begin with this. Why should we, sitting here in India, care about this third plenary session? Why should we think about its outcomes and its implications for both the Chinese and the global economic and political systems?
Hi, Anushka. Thanks so much for having me. That's a good question. Why should Indians care about what's happening in Beijing in this really closed-door, sort of esoteric meeting that takes place where we only get to know about outcomes and then suddenly there is some leak of, information of how many meetings were held, how many discussions happened without any substantive meat as to who said what and how things played out. I think the first part of it is quite straightforward, right? The Chinese economy is among the largest economies in the world, second largest economy in the world. It's also critical to global supply chains. China is India's largest trading partner as of now. It's lost that position on and off, but this year it's India's largest trading partner. It's also critical because the direction in which Chinese policy will move, particularly on emerging technologies and with regard to manufacturing, will have an impact on Indian manufacturing, will have an impact on goods supply within India, will have therefore an impact on also Indian exports. So it's important from India's point of view to understand what is the policy direction in China in the future so that you can actually understand where are the challenges and where are the opportunities from an Indian perspective, for Indian firms, for Indian investors, but also at a strategic level, which are the sectors in which China is likely to dominate, and what are the downstream implications of that for us, not just in terms of our trade with China, but also in terms of the global pushback that we are seeing over issues like overcapacity and things like that. So it's really important for us to therefore know the direction in which money is going to go in China, and whether the economy is going to be stable going forward, because all of that will have downstream implications for India.
Right. I think that's a really interesting point regarding, knowing the implications of a move made by, maybe a competitor government or a government that largely can also dictate the trajectory of a lot of business activities and export activities in the Indian economy. And of course, China is that, right? So it definitely makes sense for the Indian audience to kind of understand what political meetings, no matter how esoteric, like the Third Plenum, can maybe tell us about the political sentiment in the CPC about the potential economic trajectory of the country. On to the actual decisions document itself, Manoj. Could you also tell our listeners a little bit about maybe these sentiments reflected in the decisions document? What are the broad takeaways, if any, on, the economic and technological trajectory of the country? And not to maybe ask you to read Xi Jinping's or the drafters' minds, but what does the presence or absence of certain phrases in the document tell you about the priorities of a country whose economy is indeed slowing down and facing structural headwinds?
Yeah, I mean, look, the easy answer to that is that there was nothing terribly surprising. I was talking to a couple of people who track China closely before this issue evolved, before the plenum took place, and I think there was some sort of consensus in general that there is very little clarity on what sort of policy change are we likely to see. There was lots of conversation among Chinese scholars and academics about, how the government is cognizant of the challenges of the real estate sector, of local government debt, uh, of the pressures on local governments in terms of spending and meeting their targets, providing public services. The government is also cognizant of the challenges with regard to external concerns on overcapacity, and most importantly, it is cognizant of the challenges with regard to domestic demand, and therefore you're likely to see some steps in this direction. For most people sitting outside China who are observing this closely, I don't think that came across as well. And what my sense going into this was that, as much as one can know, it seems like there's likely to be tremendous policy continuity. You're not likely to see any significant announcements on any of these issues. I would say that I was partly right and partly wrong. Partly right in the sense that I think the document as a whole is an endorsement of the policy direction under Xi Jinping. The primary focus remains on technology driven or innovation driven development and innovation driven growth. And that's quite clearly stated in the document. But there are other domains when it comes to, say, domestic demand, when it comes to, say, the hukou or the household registration system, when it comes to providing support to local governments, where there is an inkling that, steps are being taken, not the kind of steps that we might have perhaps imagined, which is, a massive capital infusion. But there is sort of tinkering at the margins that is happening. There are structural changes that are being talked about, which, we can get into that later, but which might have an impact in terms of the overall shape of how things evolve. The other sort of really interesting thing in the document was that, two more points. One is that there was a focus. Third plenums are usually primarily around economic policy. But there was a focus in this document on national security, also foreign affairs. There was a focus on, the PLA reforms and civil military reforms. There was also a focus on work related to foreign affairs, such as sanctions and things like that. So, which is very different from what we've conventionally seen. And finally, there was a deadline of 2029 by which all these tasks that are listed in this document that need to be achieved, which again is very interesting because, you can read it two ways. You can read it as a effort to try and infuse a certain degree of urgency among cadres whom Xi Jinping is unhappy with, whom he feels have a sense. I mean, he's worried about involution, indolence, and all of those things, and cadres not taking responsibility. So you can see this as sort of infusing a sense of urgency, but you can also see it as a political statement that he's making given that the next party congress, the 21st party congress, is scheduled for 2027. And by placing a 2029 deadline here, Xi Jinping is indicating that he's going to continue to stay there. So, depending on how obviously things evolve, but that's how you can interpret that. I seem to sort of fall into the category where I think that this is a political statement rather than necessarily an effort to infuse urgency among cadres. So to me, that's the sort of broad takeaway, and we can get into the specifics. I mean, if I was just end this bit of the answer with a quote from the document, the Central Committee fully affirmed the work of the Politburo since the second plenary of the 20th Central Committee. It unanimously agreed that in the face of grave and complex international environment and the arduous tasks of advancing reforms and development and ensuring stability at home, the Politburo has secured progress. So I think it's basically saying, look, we back the current policy direction.
Right. All really interesting points, Manoj. And I think about the document, not just talking about the economic and financial trajectory of the country, but also a lot of other interesting things that have roles to play in this trajectory. You talked about defense reforms and national security and foreign affairs. And just to add to that list, there is a lot of talk about maintaining cultural unity and cohesion in the country. And we know for a fact that Xi Jinping thought and culture is Xi Jinping's legacy, right? It's something that he's talked about often. He's added, the confidence in the Chinese culture as one of the four confidences. So definitely cultural cohesion and unity is a part of Xi Jinping's legacy, and it's well reflected in this document. Another thing is investing in legal awareness and education, and it's almost as if there is an effort to create kind of a grassroots governance or surveillance system where people know their responsibilities, and at the same time they don't waver from the idea that the party state's leadership is supreme. So there's a lot of this political rhetoric targeted not just towards the cadres but towards the people as well. Manoj, maybe we can come to some of the points you've talked about and discuss them in detail. And I think the first big question is on the idea of China kind of making a massive switch towards towards this phrase that's become really popular now, which is high quality growth. So growth that is more associated with technological progress and innovation rather than just process innovation targeted at high quantity production or for exports, right? And associated with this high quality kind of growth phrase is the idea of new quality productive forces, which very simply put has to do with total factor productivity, but also, the Politburo document that came out just before the third plenum said that it also has to do with enhancing social vitality. So maybe what's your takeaway from the third plenum decisions and even the communique on the focus on innovation, the space that is being created for higher technology and higher quality growth in China in this regard?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest sort of, and again, it was one of the most anticipated because it was expected that this would be the primary sort of domain of focus, and that's what's happened in the document. The document essentially talks about focusing on generic technologies, cutting edge technologies, modern engineering technologies, disruptive technologies, and the supply chain. So it's basically making the case that, look, China needs to move up the value chain in terms of its manufacturing. It needs to link technological advancement to its manufacturing industry. And it needs to nurture future industries. And it needs to therefore create a policy environment where this can be possible. What this means is that, in terms of enabling the growth of the cultivation of talents, because high skilled talents is a scarce commodity. It requires capital to go into the right areas. So therefore, pathways for capital need to be constructed that capital can go into the right sort of sectors. Which obviously means that the government will play a significant role in that. It means sort of creating national standards. It means upgrading traditional industries by infusing technologies. And it means developing, new forms of engagement with also the outside world. So that's in a nutshell the sort of approach to boosting innovation. Some of the sectors that the plenum document talks about are industries such as next generation IT, AI, aviation and aerospace, new energy, new materials, high-end equipment, biomedicine, quantum technology. It sort of focuses on these sort of emerging domains. It also talks about having traditional manufacturing upgrading traditional manufacturing through digital technologies application, through AI application, and to make sure that there is more green development or green transformation of these sectors. In fact, that particular aspect of there's a separate section in the document on green technology and environment, and I think that we tend to underplay that. It's only when we've seen Chinese EVs take over the world that people are talking about that. But I think that there is a significant recognition within Beijing that green tech is the industry of the future, and so there is sort of money going into that. When it comes to innovation, another really interesting aspect is that it's talking about how government should play a role in directing capital, yes, but you need to develop a whole range of other instruments. You need to support angel investment, venture capital, private equity investment, and you need to develop what the document calls as patient capital. This is essentially a signal to the private sector that returns will be long term. And therefore, it's essentially telling private capital that don't chase profits, chase strategic needs, which might not necessarily sit well with the private sector, right? The final point on this technology business that I would like to make is that it also talks about significant state spending, and it specifically says, and I quote, "We will establish better operation and oversight mechanisms for major industrial investment funds to ensure that capital is channeled towards our country's strategic needs. We will put in place a funding mechanism to see that the share of manufacturing in the national economy remains at a desirable level." So it's basically telling you in which way capital is going to go, whether it's state, and in which way the policy direction is going to be. And that's the objective of it, right? I mean, at the end of it, the goal is to dominate future industries, but also to build industrial and supply chains that are safe, where the risks are few, and where you can compete internationally. Another set of sectors that the document talks about in this context are integrated circuits, machine tools, medical equipment, basic software, industrial software, advanced materials, and so on and so forth. This is where they see risks, and therefore they want to work on these.
Right. Interesting stuff, Manoj. And I think this point that you've made about a kind of portion of funding going towards manufacturing also seems like a clarificatory note, because there's so much discussion now, both academic and policy, that kind of tries to make the case that China is making this direct switch away from being an exports-led or exports-oriented economy to a purely domestic consumption-led economy. And this kind of tells us that exports are going to continue to be an important part of the Chinese economic ecosystem, no matter the global sentiment. But at the same time, this idea of overcapacity has to kind of be balanced. And so for that, I think the ideas of social vitality and domestic consumption become important. But Manoj, I'm intrigued by that point you made about opening up more pathways for capital and investment. But at the same time, you said that that will come alongside more government roles. So
yeah, the idea is that government has to play a key role in directing capital, yet it wants to open up to different kinds of capital. I mean, if you just look at the earlier section to that, which talks about building a high standard socialist market economy, it quite clearly says that we want SOEs to get stronger, do better, and grow bigger with their core functions and core competitiveness enhanced, which essentially means that SOEs, state-owned enterprises, remain critical to China's overall growth. It also says that state capital will be steered towards industries and fields that are vital to national security and serve the lifeblood of the national economy, which essentially means that you're talking about a very strong state sector and government funding essentially going towards what are priorities. And we have seen, and you're telling private sector to be patient. So you're telling them that, you need to focus on strategic needs. So you're guiding capital, but you're going to open avenues for capital to come, promising returns over a period of time.
Right. Okay. So that's on the SOEs and the public side of things, and some of it is going to be reflected in the non-public economy, which is the private sector. But let's talk about what the document says about the private economy, and maybe on a broader level than what we can infer from it about consumption and investment. The document does kind of claim that cadres are going to be encouraged to remove market access barriers, fair opening of competitive infrastructure fields to business entities. So maybe that refers to parity in project allocation between SOEs and private enterprises, and a long term mechanism for private enterprises to participate in the construction of major national projects. So maybe that refers to what you were talking about regarding patient capital directed towards strategic needs. But in all of these priorities highlighted for the private sector, where is the kind of solution to low investor sentiment, higher saving sentiment within the populace, and the fact that a lot of the supply side measures to both private enterprises and their employees or the larger consumers have not really addressed the fact that the overall consumption and investment sentiment in the country is low. And so the rhetoric surrounding patient capital may not necessarily fly well, not just it's not profitable, but also because private firms can see the structural kind of
Yeah.
interventions the party state is making.
Yeah, look, I think that is where the document is quite weak. I mean, if I was a private sector enterprise in China, I would look at this and I would say, well, there isn't necessarily anything that is terribly promising. There is sort of some, fiddling around the edges where, there's a private sector promotion law which is likely to come into place sometime this year. I don't think that law necessarily has anything fundamentally. It doesn't necessarily fundamentally improve the private sector investment environment. And that's essentially for the logic. If you're a private sector enterprise, your objective is to make profit. Your objective is to make money. If upon that you are being asked to be patriotic first and think about money later, it doesn't necessarily inspire confidence. The whole idea of the private sector is to try and, make money, create employment, identify new forms of means to innovate new products, identify new themes. When you start to circumscribe which domains and how you must work, not only which domains you must work in, but also how you must work, it starts to sort of creep on investor sentiment. And also, when you see that the external environment is becoming much more hostile, it becomes challenging, right? Because your access to capital, access to data, access to technology, access to labor, all comes under, and access to markets, all comes under a cloud, right? And we're seeing this for the Chinese private sector as a whole, even for the companies which are thriving, like say BYD. It's facing tariffs in Europe, it's facing tariffs in East Asia, it's facing tariffs in Turkey. And it's therefore having to take investment decisions in those countries. So I think that it's challenging as a whole. And I don't think this document provides anything particularly to mobilize private sector enthusiasm. It talks about, again, like I said, at the margins, it talks about improvements. One is a new bankruptcy potential legislation to allow people to exit the market that can free some pent up capital. It allows for legal frameworks to, for easing of sort of levies and fees that are placed on the private sector by the government, which are significant. But again, there's local governments that have a role to play in this. It talks about, making sure that companies have the market access barriers are removed. But again, this is not new. You've been talking about this for a while. The idea of fair competition has been long talked about, but it's difficult to do that given China's political economy. And it talks about private sectors participating in national projects. Again, not new, but do you want Alibaba and Tencent, which have significant capacities in other domains, consumer tech, to suddenly go build integrated circuits, right? What can they bring to that? So I think that some of that is really challenging, right? And that's where this idea of planning the economy can be quite tricky. So I don't, if I was to look at from a private sector point of view, I don't think this document necessarily provides any sense of enthusiasm or optimism.
Yeah. The point that you made about fair competition and removal of market barriers being in discussion for a long time, you also rightly said that local governments have a very important role to play in this. And the interesting thing is that this document makes a comeback for the phrase unified national market, even though from what I understand, it hasn't been mentioned in the Central Economic and Financial Work conferences from November and December last year. And simply put, I think this may mean that the laws surrounding encouragement of private economy could also make provisions for greater interconnectedness, more standardized rules between provinces for investment.
That's the agenda, right?
Yeah.
That's the agenda. Under this idea of unified national market, the idea is to try and harmonize systems for, say, the kind of registrations that you need to do, the kind of tax filings that you need to do, the kind of bureaucracy that you need to go through if you are a company that has got businesses in 3-4 different regions in the country. The idea is to try and create some degree of harmony under this idea of the unified national market. I'm think of GST in India as an example, right? The idea was to try and create some degree of harmony. It was challenging in India. It is 100 times more challenging in China to do this, because local governments have a very strong role to play in this, and local governments tend to be extremely, extremely protective of their turf. And therefore, you hear Xi Jinping constantly railing against protectionism. So it's really difficult to do, and there will be other complications as you try to harmonize. And I mean, unified national market has been a policy priority for a long time under Xi Jinping. It's moved quite slowly, which tells you about how challenging this process is. And again, local governments rely on these revenues that they get from fees and all to try and build up their budgets, because all the public services that are provided at local levels are the responsibility of local governments. So it's not easy also for them to give up some of this, right? That's why it's challenging.
Right. But one quick follow-up question, Manoj, since you understand center provincial political relations really well as well. Wouldn't you say that perhaps if a provincial party leader makes some concerted moves towards reducing these barriers for national companies to invest locally and not really engage in maybe favoritism or protectionism, wouldn't you say these are kind of parameters? Broadly, this can be put as provincial governments being in line with the ideas proposed by the central government. Aren't these parameters for promotion or, going up the ladder and maybe getting a seat somewhere in Beijing?
I mean, yes and no, right? At the end of the day, you have to also, I might harmonize everything and lose revenue and maybe, leave the finances in a miserable state. And I might be unable to deal with my local service burdens. Then what do I do? It's not like the central leadership is going to say, well, you've been nice, so you must get more money from us, right? Central transfers are quite strict. So that's, so it's the incentive structure is not as straightforward. I mean, to that said, in this document, there is and I said this earlier that there were things that I was wrong about earlier. This is something that I think I was wrong about, which is that you do see in this document that there is a recognition of this particular challenge of local governments. There is no mass stimulus or funding that is being provided to local governments, but it does talk about certain tax changes. So such as it talks about expanding the sources of tax revenues for local governments. It talks about, say, on consumption tax in particular. It allows the local governments some freedom, or it promises to allow the local government some freedom on setting tax rates. It also talks about the need to expand the use of funds raised from local governments and providing special purpose bonds, which are provided by the central government, and giving local governments greater authority and increasing the share of their expenditure in the total government expenditure. So I think that there is some commitment to try and provide greater support to local governments, which I think is the right direction. You need to be able to, the document says, to place more fiscal resources at the disposal of local governments. We will expand the sources of tax revenue at the local level and grant greater authority for the tax management to local governments as appropriate. Improve the system of transfer payments. We will overhaul the special transfer payments and increase the scale of general transfer payments. So they are intending to provide more funding. There's an entire section on that, which obviously I can't read, but if you're interested, please go and read. But it does promise a whole set of changes in that sense, which is, I think, a positive thing given how strapped and debt-laden local governments are.
So maybe that greater budget for transfer.
It could alleviate some of these challenges, yes.
Right. And of course, the other rhetoric also kind of maybe directed at alleviating tensions that may exist between the provincial and central governments. Interesting chat, Manoj, but I have one final question regarding some of the things that we talked about in the introduction that are maybe new and kind of fascinating to see in a document such as this one, the outcome document of Third Plenum. And one of the things that you alluded to was the mentions regarding a trajectory for foreign policy and national security. And, there are interesting things in the document about creating a good quality national security environment and so on and so forth. So what may this mean, so to say, regarding not just budgetary allocations, but also political emphasis on both domestic and external aspects of uh,
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean,
Yeah.
frankly, if you look at the document, the national security bit in the document, specifically to national security, actually deals with domestic issues rather than external issues as much. It deals with issues from, issues related to industry, issues related to social governance, issues related to, say, early warning systems and disasters and things like that, issues related to community governance through what is called the Feng Shui model, or the Feng Shui experience, which is essentially where you're anticipating challenges and you're mobilizing local governments, local sort of people, community people, to try and address some of those challenges. It talks about, early warning and prevention and control. It talks about protecting Chinese citizens who are overseas, and they're the only sort of foreign element in that clearly is around foreign sanctions, or so-called long-arm jurisdiction, and China's maritime rights and interests. But predominantly that is domestic. Along with this decision document, there was an explanation that was issued by Xi Jinping, which I think was really interesting because he talks about also, within the context of national security, he talks about artificial intelligence, right? So systems for oversight of artificial intelligence development. He talks about leveraging science and technology to safeguard national security. I'm not sure what that means, but essentially the idea is perhaps to mitigate the risks of coercion from other actors, or perhaps advancing your defense technology, or things like data security and all that. He also talks about a population management system, as a national security imperative. Again, I don't know what shape or form that takes, but I think it's important to keep an eye on that. The last point in all of this that I think I will mention is that in Xi Jinping's explanation, he talks about establishing sound coordination mechanisms for promoting security in neighboring regions. Now, from an Indian point of view, I think this is really interesting because I don't, again, know what shape or form this takes. But if you look around you, you're seeing China much more active within our immediate periphery, but also within Central Asia, within East Asia, through different mechanisms, right? It has a China Central Asia 5 mechanism. It has increasingly set up a China South Asia mechanism, which excludes India. So you're seeing these new coordination groups that are coming up. So the China Central Asia mechanism is far more detailed. It deals with security, development, and everything. The China South Asia mechanisms have dealt with specific issues like poverty, rural development, things like that, but largely developmental issues. During the COVID pandemic, they dealt with COVID. But it's interesting to see what sort of new mechanisms Beijing is thinking about and what it's talking about. The fact that this plenum document actually refers to neighboring regions and a security mechanism for neighboring regions, to me is troubling from an Indian interest perspective. It tells you that you're likely to see a far more active Beijing in our region. In what shape or form, we'll wait and see. I also want to say that in this context, it's important to note that Beijing and Moscow often talk about a new security architecture in Eurasia. Again, we don't know what that means and how that plays out. We've seen some changes in the region with a Russian mutual defense sort of agreement with North Korea. So yeah, this is again an evolving space to watch out for, where potentially you might see new groupings come up within the region. What does this mean for BRICS? What does this mean for SCO? Again, we'll have to wait and watch to see whether there is any meat on the bones. But yeah, I think it's important to keep note of this.
Interesting. So the explanation document has left more questions unanswered than the decisions document itself, and clearly a lot for India to look out for. And that functional experience kind of aspect is really interesting to me because it's such an old concept that's kind of being revived and being inserted into party cadres, political rhetoric. And I'd like to believe that that point you made about leveraging science and technology for national security also ties in with the idea that Functional experience in the quote unquote new era means creating digital warriors in every neighborhood, nook and cranny. And, you know, um, so you don't just have the village party boards to look out for, you also have to look out for your cyber neighbor and so on and so forth. But yes, Manoj, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting chat. For listeners who are interested in understanding some of these concepts in greater detail, please do follow Manoj's daily newsletter tracking people's daily, where he does a breakdown of important political statements and, of course, as the name suggests, of the party's daily newspaper as well. And he also presented a testimony in June in front of the US China Economic and Security Review Commission, where he talked about some of the concepts we discussed in this podcast, like the Feng Chao experience and even the Chaoyang masses, which again may have to do with mobilizing the masses for an economic and national security cause. So thank you so much, Manoj, for your insights. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.